Howdy, hello, Dr. G here. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the U.S. regional foods of the South. So the first thing to know is that the South covers a lot of territory. The South region actually has 3 different regions in it, and you'll see because of that there's going to be a wide variety of geography. So you have coastline, the Atlantic coast, and you have the Gulf Coast. You have all sorts of geography within the states. And you will also see that just the people groups who planted themselves in these different regions and subregions, that they imparted a lot of different flavors and varieties. And I said that just now. So major influences that we see come from the English, the French, the Africans, particularly slaves, right, and Native Americans. And we'll note that because of the influence of Christianity and the forced conversion of Native Americans and the slave owner traditions and how they parted their ways onto the African slaves, that Sunday meals and other gatherings are important social events. So there are many different things that we're going to cover of like who influenced Southern cuisine. So the first one is the land itself. The ways that were learned from Native Americans certainly influenced Southern cuisine. So corn, huge influence on Southern cuisine, particularly cornbread, which I have a little cornbread muffin shown here. The beans and squash, right? So that Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash go together. Wild games, fruits. We've talked about hickory and pecans before. Fish was particularly in the streams and in rivers that you would see lots of different fish, including this is a whole catfish here. Sweet potatoes and pumpkins, other kinds of gourds and things like that. Then we also saw the European, the French, the Spanish, and the English influences. So they brought over wheat, particularly when we think about English bringing over wheat. They brought over pigs, right? And so we think of pork chops and everything else, and this is barbecue. They brought over cattle. They brought over potatoes, but remember, potatoes did not originate in Europe. Where'd they come from? Hopefully you just said Peru in your head. But, and then they also have a big influence with the apples. So the South also had influences from that Southern slave trade we've talked about previously. And the things that the South got from Africa included peanuts. And I just wanted to show you, I think this is really cool. People often don't know, where do peanuts come from? How do they grow? That they grow in the ground. They are a legume that grows in the ground, and you pick up the plant, the peanut plant, and underneath it you see these beautiful peanuts that then have to be cleaned off and stuff. So I'll tell you a really random story, but hopefully it'll help you remember a little bit about peanuts. That one of my friends, I played tennis when I was in college, and one of my teammates, she was from Michigan, and they didn't eat a whole lot of peanuts, I don't know, in Michigan. And so when we went to a restaurant and they had peanuts as an appetizer, she got these peanuts in the shell and thought you just eat the whole thing, in which the rest of us who are from Texas just thought that was disgusting, because look at the shells, right? That they're covered in dirt, and while they might be washed off, they're not washed, in our opinion, as well as we would want them to. So we were like, no, Amy, you have to take them out and just eat the nut. But so you get peanuts from Africa, you have okra, which we'll see a beautiful mixture of the French and the African influences in a dish from Louisiana in a little bit. Watermelons and sesame seeds. So we've talked about that before. And then there was this shared cultivation of rice, or shared rice cultivation techniques. So they learned from each other. So we're going to talk about some different dishes. So we already talked about the fact that there's lots of hot bread, quick breads, like cornbread and things like that. Tomatoes and okra mixed together, biscuits and jam. We talked about previously when we talked about slaves and African American roots, that we talked about the different parts of the pig, including fatback and cracklings and chitlins. I said chitterlings. I can't believe that. Chitlins. And I don't think we talked about red-eye gravy before, and I wanted to show you this picture to hopefully help you remember. So red-eye gravy, oftentimes we think about it when you think about the eye part. Okay, it'll wake me up. It's gravy that comes from pork drippings. So here's like a pork chop, right? And coffee. So you mix that together, and it's often day-old coffee that was left over. What are we going to do with it? Let's mix it with the pork drippings, ham drippings, and make gravy for, you can make it for breakfast, you can make it for an evening meal, that kind of thing, but it's typically served over the pork itself. In this case, we see that there are traditional grits and a fried egg over easy. And then I had a picture earlier with the greens as well, so cooked greens certainly of importance. We talked about Brunswick stew when we were talking about Native Americans of the South. Fried chicken was certainly something that we see a lot of. Blue crab. Rice is going to be not the wild rice, but a long grain or a Carolina gold rice. And because of all of that rice, so rice grows really well in wet climates. So you saw that in the video about the wild rice. It needs a lot of water. And so we have lots of boggy areas where rice grows well and rice paddies can occur. And one of the dishes that we see that's a combination from African roots and the rice here in the U.S. is Hoppin' John. And Hoppin' John is just rice we have here and black-eyed peas, and it's typically got some bacon in it or some green pepper or some chopped up onion as well. And certainly when you talk about tea, think sweet tea. We've kind of slowly starting to move away from tea is just sweet tea in the South, but when my family from the North comes down, they often were surprised that they would order tea and it would come sweetened already. Or when my parents went up to Connecticut to meet my in-laws, my father ordered tea and got it and was like, there's something wrong with this. He knew what was wrong with it. It wasn't made with sweet tea. And in fact, interestingly enough, just to tell you how much sweet tea is such an important part of the Southern culture, the Georgia State Legislature passed a law probably about 10 years ago now that emphasized how there is a legal way of how you make sweet tea in Georgia, that you have to do. You can't just make tea, have it cold, and add sugar to it, because then the sugar doesn't integrate into and disperse into the tea well. And so I think it's kind of interesting that us being Southerners, we have to have an argument about what sweet tea is and make it right, or it's not sweet tea. So there are several different cuisines that we highlight in the South, one being Creole, that this is more in the Louisiana area. And you see Creole is a mixture of French, Spanish, African, English, and Native American influences all together. When you are making a dish, you often begin with a roux, and that's how you pronounce that word, R-O-U-X, is roux. It's a French word, just meaning flour and butter mixed together, so that you get a browned look to a lot of your dishes, because that flour and butter are mixed together and browned in the pan before you begin making sauces and things like that. Or you might begin with the base of onions, bell pepper, and celery to be able to begin a dish as well. But I will say that Creole has a lot of crazy flavor profiles to it, known for some kick, some heat to a lot of their dishes, but very complex flavors. And we'll show you the Creole French influenced dishes here that I didn't show you gumbo, but gumbo is a roux. Remember that butter and flour thickened soup that has seafood, sausage, and okra. That makes it a little bit sticky, right? And seasonings with it. That is a yummy soup. But then I have jambalaya here. Most of you may have seen a gumbo at some point, but maybe not. Jambalaya is a thick dish, and this is jambalaya right here, of seafood. So you can see some shrimp here, and sausage. So here's the sausage, and some vegetables. You can see different colors, and rice all mixed together. So it's got it's just a crazy mix of all different kinds of things. It does not have okra in it, so it's important for you to distinguish the difference between those two, that okra wouldn't, and it's thick. It's not a soup. So okra is typically not included in jambalaya. And then etouffee just means covered, meat or seafood covered in a thick sauce. And this is actually crawfish etouffee here. You see the thick sauce, and then it's served over rice. So this is just a beautiful presentation, but you would mix it together. And the reason why I showed you crawfish etouffee is because crawfish is something that's very common from Creole cuisine, thinking again about being from the Louisiana area. And speaking of Louisiana, New Orleans being one of the cities of Louisiana, main city that people will go to taste a little highlight of cuisine, and these two dishes are just quintessential New Orleans. And if you ever go to New Orleans, those of you who have said, oh, I don't go travel much, I've never been out of the United States, well, here's an opportunity. It's not that far. It's a little bit of a trip, probably take you 2 days to get there, but it is so worth the drive to go to New Orleans and just to experience the wonder and amazement of the city. But you have to promise me you will do this. If you ever get to New Orleans, you will go to Café du Monde, and it is the place to go to get beignets. And these are, you see right here, deep fried squares of goodness. They're kind of like a donut, but clearly they're not shaped like a donut, and they're served with powdered sugar. And just get the traditional beignets, and then café au lait, which is this very strong coffee that's also flavored, so ground with chicory nuts, and then you serve it, of course, because the au lait, with milk. You can get, I believe Dr. Harris actually has a container of this type of coffee that you can get that comes from the region, but just know that it's like got chicory in it, so it's a little bit of a different flavor to it. It's not nutty. Chicory's not nutty, in my opinion, but just a very different, very strong flavor. So, okay, being a Texas girl and living in North Carolina, we have to, when we talk about Southern cuisine, we have to talk about and compare and contrast barbecue. If you can't compare and contrast your barbecue, then you haven't learned anything about the South. So there are 3 different types of barbecue I want to highlight, one of them being not from the South, but it kind of gets mixed in. So we have Texas barbecue. Texas barbecue is marinated and basted barbecue. You can see this guy here is basting his barbecue with a sauce. The sauce is both sweet and spicy. Sugar, but it's got some kick to it too. It's not uber hot like capsaicin hot, peppery hot, but it's just got lots of spice to it, and you often put a rub on there. But what you see is that, one, it's beef, not pork. So no Texas barbecue is beef all the way. And this is, I think, a really good picture to show you what the beef brisket looks like, that you can see that rub has been put on. So it gets a nice char to it. Even when you marinate it or you baste it in sauce while it's cooking, that because of what's in it, it gets a char to it. But remember, key thing is that it's beef. Then we're going to go to Kansas City, which is not considered part of the South, but Kansas City barbecue is barbecue. And in this case, the two differences, so we see a thick sweet sauce. It's a different flavor profile than what you would see in the Texas barbecue. It's super sweet, in my opinion, compared to the Texas barbecue. And it doesn't char. Like, see how it's not really that charred. And it's pork. So these are pork ribs, not beef. And then we have our beautiful North Carolina barbecue. Shh, don't tell anybody, but I actually prefer North Carolina barbecue over Texas barbecue. I'm serious, don't tell anybody. I might get killed when I go back home. But that barbecue is a pork barbecue that typically is pulled pork, right? As opposed to the ribs that you see in Kansas City. So pulled pork barbecue, and the sauce is a vinegar based. And we're not going to go east versus west North Carolina. This is just down east, vinegar based barbecue, and you can sauce, and you can see it's runny. It's not a thick sauce. And the reason why, okay, I'll tell you why I love North Carolina barbecue. I love sour things. I love salt and vinegar chips, and so North Carolina barbecue sauce is amazing to me. Not saying that Texas barbecue isn't wonderful, because it is, but just that's my personal preference. Another highlighted cuisine that you should know is Tex-Mex, and I personally prefer traditional Mexican foods over Tex-Mex, even though I grew up on Tex-Mex. That's just because I like the flavor profiles a little bit more. It's not as heavy. So in my opinion, Tex-Mex is pretty heavy because it's got the Mexican influences, but it's got a lot more cheese. We see, and it's oftentimes cheddar cheese. So, or Colby Jack, but it's got a lot more cheese on it. And you'll see heavy amounts of sour cream and guacamole, which the guacamole is certainly traditional. Sour cream, not as much. And so we have nachos here that clearly you can pick apart and say, well, that olive, that's not a typical Mexican thing. It is Spanish, but not Mexican, or in this case, these olives are black, so it's more of an Italian thing. But all that said, that Tex-Mex is still yummy. In this region in North Carolina, you can find some good Tex-Mex places if you look. So that's a wrap up of the Southern regional cuisine. I hope you enjoy it. I hope I've inspired you maybe to go on a road trip somewhere and get to know the different regional cuisines, and especially the influences of the region. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I am happy to help.